Welcome to the Flatbill Pastor Podcast.
Yeah.
My name's Becca Wood.
And my name is Clint Nolder.
How are you doing, Clint Nolder?
I'm doing just splendiferous.
Good. I'm so glad.
Yeah. How are you?
Good. I'm really good. We are on episode 8 this week.
Episode 8,
Mm-hmm.
the August episode.
Yeah.
It's almost fall.
It's crazy.
Doesn't feel like it.
It doesn't feel like fall. I don't know where you're listening from, but it is super hot and humid still.
It's hot.
It is. It is.
That's right. Like a fajita.
Yeah. So this month's episode, we are talking about something that one of our listeners actually texted in.
Yeah, because we do that. You can text in,
Mhm.
right? By just texting the word podcast, 678-661-6330.
Yeah, I like that little plug. That was awesome.
678-661-6330.
Yeah. So your topic might get picked for next episode. So that's really cool that you can do that.
Yeah.
And you can stream anywhere you listen to your podcasts. And if you want to, you can watch us on YouTube.
That's right. You can look at our faces right now.
Yes.
That's it. You have an incredible Whitney shirt on.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I was feeling Whitney this morning.
That's good.
Yeah.
You woke up.
Exactly.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, I was feeling like I should probably wear a black shirt today. So
No one expected that,
I
I'm
know.
sure.
I know. I do need a new hat, though. This hat's getting... Honestly, I've been looking for another one of these exact hats, and I can't find one anywhere. I search the web probably once or twice a week looking for this hat because I'd like to replace it. I cannot find it anywhere. So for those of you who are listening, if you'll stop and you'll get on YouTube and look, you can see the hat, and then maybe you have a connection to find one. I'd love to order at least one, maybe two.
And text us again
Text Flatbill hat, Flatbill Black Braves hat. But it's special. It's got a little square on it anyway. Anyway, never mind.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, well, good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's jump right in.
Yeah.
So our listener, they wanted to know for this topic, is it possible to hear from God?
That's a big one.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of broad, but I feel like that everyone wants to know what is God's voice if he is speaking to us. Is it audible? Do we see signs? Like what does that look like? What kind of communication does God give us?
Yeah. That's a huge question. I can't tell you as a pastor how often I have this conversation, and it typically revolves around like a big decision. Right? Someone's got a decision to make. Maybe they have 2 job opportunities, or maybe they've got to decide if they're going to stay here or move somewhere else. Or maybe they've got to figure out, hey, which school our kids are going to go to, or should I homeschool or should I public school? Like just big life decisions, right? Or who should I marry? All those things, like just any of the big life things. And so they want to have hey, how do I know what God is saying to me? How do I know which choice is the right choice? How do I hear God's voice? Because for sure they're saying, hey, I'm asking God. I am speaking to God. Is he talking back? And how do I know if he's talking back? That's a huge question. And the short answer is yes. Yeah. God does speak in our direction. We can hear God's voice. Is it a simple answer? Yes, that he speaks the way I'm speaking now into a microphone that you can just press play whenever you want to, right? So as soon as you get in the situation, it's like, you know what? I should go listen to a podcast that talks about the situation that I'm in. Let me go dial that up and hit play, and all of a sudden God's voice is magically going to come out of whatever I press play on, my radio, my phone, whatever it is. Like, that's not the way that God's voice works. He's not your on-demand playlist with answers to your big life questions. However, God is interested in giving you insight and thoughts and feelings and discernment and wisdom that specifically can be applied to whatever situation, life circumstance that you're in, or it could just be a life-shaping moment that says, "Hey, I'm gonna speak to you. I'm gonna teach you in this moment so that later on it'll impact the way you make decisions." That is a doable thing. It's 100% a realistic expectation to say, um, I speak to God through prayer, through our conversations, our questions, our pleas. Sometimes I found myself even begging God, that we have the ability to speak to Him, but 100% He's interested, not just interested, He does communicate back.
Mm.
Um, it's Unfortunately, it's not as easy as hitting play on a MP3.
Yeah.
Not an MP3.
I
Whatever.
they're
Hitting
gonna be
play
like,
on
what is that?"
hitting play on a whatever you hit play on, the music or noise comes out. Not
Yeah.
that easy.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think too, people wanna manipulate, the fact like, "Hey, if God, if you're listening right now, or if you think I should do this, that, the other, give me a sign. What is that sign?" And they're
Yeah.
looking for these signs constantly and like, "Oh, well, the light, up there turned green. That's God's way of saying that's a green light." So
Yeah.
it's kinda hard to maybe discern what comes from God
Right.
and what doesn't.
Yeah, I've actually got a story about that. Um, in my own life, uh, goodness, I was in a place where, um I'm trying to think how old I was. I was probably 9, maybe 10 years old, somewhere around there, maybe 9, 10, or 11. I don't remember the exact year. My parents had just gotten a divorce, and I just felt like life wasn't going my way. I was pretty upset about the divorce deal, and just kind of beside myself with how life was working and happening. Um, and I remember there was one night I was in my room and the door was closed, and I had this, which at the time I thought was legit. At the time, I had this picture of Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson that was in a gold frame. I'm trying to visualize it, like I can see their faces. I'm pretty sure they were wearing Dream Team uniforms, like USA Team USA uniforms. I'm pretty sure that's what it was, and they were on this picture, and it was signed. And so at the time, I thought it was a legit signature. Turns out, like as I got older, I realized it was just like a reprint, the kind of thing. It wasn't actually they didn't actually sign that
Aw.
that photo or whatever. But nevertheless, it was hanging on my wall, and it was one of my prized possessions. Like I thought this thing was so incredibly cool, right? And it hung. So I had a Nerf basketball goal that went on my little closet door. That I could slam dunk on and beat my brothers and my cousins at basketball because I was obviously taller, bigger than them at the time. They were 4 years younger than me. And so I would dominate there in my little Nerf arena. And then over to the side, I had Magic and Mike. Not Magic Mike, but you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I had Magic and Mike over there on the side that would oversee my basketball dominance in my room. And so I was sitting there one night and I was just upset with God. I was upset with life. I was upset with my parents. I don't know, I was just having one of those nights. And I told God, I was like, "Hey, here's the deal. Why did you do this? Why did you let this happen? Um, why why haven't you stepped in to make any of this better? I feel awful. Family's messed up. Like, come on. Like, where aren't you supposed to be the God that like keeps people together? Aren't you supposed to be the God that like, makes things right and beautiful and pretty and like all those things?" And so I'm having this conversation and I just don't hear anything. I don't hear any assurance. I don't feel any assurance. I have no peace. I don't feel any kind of love. I'm just frustrated and I'm angry. And so finally I decide, you know what? It's time for me to decide whether or not God is real or not, right? Because obviously the God that I thought I believed in hasn't shown up for me. So I told God, I was like, all right, here we go. I'm just gonna see if you're legit or not. So you see over there, Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, see the picture, God? I know you can see it. It's right over there on the wall. If you're real, knock the picture off the wall, right? If you're real, knock the picture off the wall. And so I was sitting there and I was staring at, Michael and Magic, and I was like, sorry, fellas, but I'm about to put God to the test and y'all are going to be punished for it. We're sitting there looking at it and nothing happens. Like I'm just staring at it for 30, 45 seconds. And then I was like, okay, well, maybe I need to, maybe this is one of those prayers you got to pray out loud. So pray out loud a little bit like, hey, God, if you'll knock the picture off the wall, then I will believe that you are actually caring and doing something about what I'm going through. Cause right now it doesn't feel like it. And I sit there and I sit there and sit there and nothing happens. And then I'm getting a little frustrated because in my heart, it's like, you know what? I want God to be real. I want God to be a part of my life. I want God to care about the mess that I feel like He's allowed to happen to me. And so I simply want to say, hey, here's the deal. I can overlook all those things if I know that you're actually actively doing something about the mess that I'm in. And so then I begin to kind of internally grit my teeth at him. And
Mhm.
it's like, hey, God, come on. Here's the deal. I'm giving you a chance to prove that you are who you say you are. So go ahead and knock the picture off the wall, right? And so I'm staring at the picture. I'm staring at God. I'm starting to cry a little bit because it's like, look, I've got my whole life. And up until then, it was like I said, 9 or 10 years. Like I put my whole life, all my trust, all those things in you, and you are sorely disappointing me. Like, come on, can you deliver something here? Knock the picture off the wall. I can't hear you. I don't feel you. I just want to see that you care about what's happening. And I remember I eventually fell asleep and I woke up the next morning. And the very first thing I did when I opened my eyes was I looked over at the wall and the picture was still hanging there.
Mm,
And I was so disappointed.
mm,
I was like, man, God, I haven't asked for much from you. Simple picture. Just a simple picture,
mm,
but it's still hanging. And so I know what it feels like. I'll never forget what that feels like to be just feel like my whole life is falling apart and all I wanted to God. I didn't even have the expectation God would fix it because it was too late.
mm,
But I at least wanted God to know, or I wanted to know if God was actually there. Did he actually care about what's happening? And so I think when I think through that though, I think the thing that I've learned is when I look back, I can see God moving in my life in that period of time, though in the moment I couldn't. However, having the opportunity to look back has taught me how to look for God today.
mm,
You know, when I look backwards, I look at provision. Um, we lived in East Point and Hateville, which is on the southwest side of Atlanta, and schools there weren't the greatest. Yet somehow my dad is a plumber, and he does really well now. He's a master plumber, does really well. But at the time, he was pretty new. I mean, he had been. I think I remember him finishing school, and I was 4 or 5 or 6, something like that. So this wasn't too far after he was early on in his career, and so he wasn't in charge. He wasn't a foreman. He wasn't a boss. He was just he's a plumber working at a plumbing company. And once they got divorced, it's like, man, we were in this private school, and surely after they got divorced, like he didn't have the ability to do that. I don't know how I went to that school. Looking back, I've never asked who paid for me to go or who paid for me to continue to go because it wasn't my dad. And somehow God provided for that. When I look at some of the most formative adults in my life that helped shape and create who I am, a lot of those are teachers that were at that school that knew what I was walking through and going through, that at least from my perspective, it seemed like they spent a little extra time with me. And it was a small school. I mean, at times we had 14, 15 people in our class. Uh, my eighth grade class, there's 8 of us,
oh my
right?
goodness.
Yeah. And so we got to know the teachers really well, and and they just cared so well for me. And all of them were followers of Jesus, and they partnered with my dad as I continued to move up and get older. And then my dad met uh, a lady named Amy, and which I see as like my mom today. She's been a huge part of raising me and was there and, a part of everything in my adolescence and attended everything and showed up for everything. And she was a huge part of who I am also. Um, she was a teacher at that school, you know, and um, my dad got to know her because my little brother, who was 4 years younger than me, was in her class. So a little parent teacher conference happened, you know
Okay.
what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
evidently, like one thing led to another, went to dates and ta-da, hello, they're married. Um, and so like you look at things like that. Um, there was a portion of time where we moved into with my uncle and his two boys, and it was my dad and us two. So there's six guys in one house. But when I think back about that, I have a little brother. His name is Travis. But I also feel like I have two other little brothers because of the we were so close. And there's six guys in this three-bedroom house. It was like 1,400 square foot. It was teeny tiny. And so my uncle Dan got a room, my dad got a room, and the four boys had bunk beds in one room.
Mm,
But I'm so close. I'm so close to those guys. Like Josh, he feels like a brother to me because of the way we grew up. And when I see that, hey, like life didn't work out the way I wanted to write the little fairy tale, but God continued to have people in my life that just showed up over and over and over and over again. Um, I mean, there's a million other things, but when I
mhm,
look back, it's like, man, God was speaking to me so clearly, but I was just a little too young or immature in my faith to be able to understand that how God speaks to us, provides for us, and gives us direction. Because in my mind, there was one way: either you fix my life to make it to where I know it aligns with everything you want, or knock the picture off the wall.
mm,
Right. And both of those things, looking back, aren't the ways that God does those things for us.
mhm,
God was consistent in his character in those moments, and not so much in terms of meeting my own expectations. Though, when I look back now as someone in my late 30s, which I just entered just a couple weeks ago, I'll turn 40 here in a few months. And so I've just now gotten to my late 30s. Uh, I appreciate the way that God spoke to me, even though I didn't quite understand
mm.
his voice and the words that were being given to me. So,
Oh, love that story. I didn't know a lot of that.
yeah,
That's really cool. But it does go to show you that sometimes God speaks to us and we don't know until maybe after the fact or, in hindsight,
sure.
what was exactly going on. But that's why I think it's important to know how God communicates, um, because it's not always a yes or always a no. It's not always definite. It's sometimes later
Right.
or not right now, and He doesn't speak it at all. So I guess how do people wrestle with the absence, the not right now? How do they become patient, and how does that intersect with their faith?
Yeah. So I think the one of the first things to remember about God is that he's consistent. And so, regardless of generations or eras, um, countries, languages, God's consistent. And so his character is consistent, his expectations are consistent. Um, and the way that he predominantly communicates, at least like 99% of the time, is through the presence of consistent principles. And so it's one thing for a child um, to ask the question, um, goodness, I don't know, like, hey, it's bedtime. Let's pretend it's bedtime. I'm just like trying to think here.
Mhm.
But it's bedtime, and let's just say their bedtime's 8:30, and it's 8:25, and they come in and they say, "Hey, can we watch one more show?" Right? So a lot of times that's the way we want to communicate with God. Like, we know what he expects from us. We know that he expects us to, for this analogy, he expects us to be in bed at 8:30.
Mm.
Yet we go at 8:25 and say, "Hey, can we watch one more show?" Whatever experience of life we're in, whatever it is. And then we say, "Well, he didn't answer us." Well, no, he already answered us before, because he said the expectation is you're in bed at 8:30. We just went back to him with the question, and now we're angry he didn't answer in that moment. But the truth is that principle has been existing for a long time. And so just because we chose or decided, is there a way around the principle in this one particular situation? Like on this particular Wednesday night, is there a way he'll let me stay up a little bit later? And God is just saying, I'm consistent. My expectations in terms of what I want for you, desire for you are not going to change. And so I already answered this question. You're just bringing the question up and you're wondering why I'm quiet right now. It's because I said it loud enough before. And if you really wanted to know the answer, you would go back to where I've already answered this question. And that's the way that God uses principles that we can find throughout the biblical narrative. When we study the life of Jesus and the words of Jesus, a lot of times those principles are laid out. And while we won't have the exact same situation, the principle will be the exact same. And that applies to our life now. And so, as we're processing, hey, what does God want for me next? Well, the first thing that we've got to ask is, has God already spoken on the subject? Not necessarily my specific decision, but the principles involved in my specific decision. Has He already spoken on this? Because what parent likes to repeat themselves,
Mm.
right? Like, how many times do I have to tell you? How many times have I said that? Golly.
I know,
How, you know what I'm
relatable.
saying? How many times I got to tell you, right? Like, and I would imagine God feels the same way as we call Him Father. He's like, guys, we've already talked about this. And so sometimes we've got to slow down enough to say, okay, let me look at the principles that are happening here to see if I can pull from those to help answer my question because God's already spoken on them. Now, when we think about being aware of those principles, the only way to do that is for us to spend some time reading and studying, which a lot of times that's not convenient for us because we think about, oh, shoot, I should ask God what I should do here. And it's time to make a decision. Right. And so, it's like, all right, well, it's like the student who's cramming for the test the night before, but it's a years worth of content. And it's like, okay, well, now they've decided they want to study. And then they ask God, will you bless my study time? And he's like, I just gave you 179 school days. And on the 180th, it's time for you to take the test. And you want to cram it all into one night and then blame God because it doesn't go well when He just gifted you a teacher that gave you content, gave you access to the material, gave you access to the answers, gave you opportunities to ask questions, gave you opportunities to break it down into small chunks. Like God provided all of that. And then you say, well, God's not even listening to me, right? God didn't show up for me when I needed Him most. And God's like, I was there for 180 days. You mean I'm not your magician,
Mm.
right? I didn't pull the rabbit A plus out of the hat. No, you pulled out of the hat what you put into the hat, which is a load of junk, and it's your hat. I'm not the guy who's going to change whatever's in there to something magical. And it's the same thing, when we think through our own life is we've got to realize that life is important enough for us to search for answers before we actually need them, right? Why would we not be prepared for the most important moments in our life? Why would we not take the time to say, you know what, let me see what God has to say about situations and principles and thoughts that are applicable to any area of life? Why would I not be interested in that? Because then I can still make a decision to say, I disagree with you, God, but at least I know what you think. I think you're wrong, but at least I know what you think. And then that gives us opportunity to move forward the way we want to, and then to make a decision. All right, did this go the way I wanted it to? It did not. I wonder if it's because I told God your way was wrong and my way was right and I ignored it. Well, then we get the opportunity to test and prove what we believe is the will of God or our own personal desires. And I there's no other way around it. Like most of the time, there's exceptions, but most of the time, God speaks to us through the examples in the life of Jesus, and He wants those lessons to echo in our own lives for all of the time that we've been gifted. But if we ignore those principles if we just want to cram for the test the night before, God's saying, look, you're missing the greatest speech I've given
Mm.
that talks about things that inform how you will move forward, and you're ignoring it. You just want it the magic man way, right? And
Mm.
God doesn't want to be our magician. He wants to be our father. He wants to spend time with us, for us to spend time with him, and for us to learn as we go so that we could be ready when those things happen in our life.
For sure. So I guess my next question would be then, how do we develop that skill? Where do we go to learn those principles, and how do we get that experience and really just develop that skill?
Yeah, what I try to tell people is you've got to find a spiritual big brother, a big sister, or a spiritual father, or spiritual mother, someone who's further along in the spiritual journey than you, the faith journey, and you've got to spend some time with them and say, "Hey, look, I'd like to just talk to you about life."
Mm.
And how you figured out. Maybe you look at forward and you're like, man, I admire how they've leveraged their faith to get where they are. And you just say, hey, I just want to. Are you available for me to run some things by you, just for me to hear your perspective, right? And that's tough, right? Because you're asking almost for a mentor, but it's not about mentorship. It's about friendship and relationships. I mean, here at Foundation, we've got groups, right, that
Mhm.
run, and we do 2 semesters of groups. A lot of times I have people, especially younger people, that are single or they're newly married, and they come and they say, hey, is there a group that's for us? Right now, I can see a really great advantage for that. Like, hey, we want to talk about our own season of life. For single folks, they're looking to meet other people, and so that's an important thing. And say, hey, we want to meet faith followers, and so rather than go out to X, Y, or Z, and it'd be great if we met a guy or a girl that was in love with Jesus, and so that makes sense. Like, I get that side,
Mhm.
but I also see this enormous value of being involved in some Bible study and community with people that are not in your season of life, especially for people that are further along in your season of life. Like, that's a gift that God gives us. And the single person or the newly wedded couple, like, they're also a gift to the people that are 20 and 30 years past them. They're a gift in the way that sometimes folks that have been doing something for so long, while they will be great at principles, they are terrible in terms of just understanding the way the world works outside of those principles, and making sure that those principles can be relayed to someone in a way that makes sense and is relevant. So, there, as Christians, we can get set in our ways, and we can honestly become detrimental and hindrances to new believers or to younger people in the faith, because we feel like we figured it out so much. And so, man, it could be a breath of fresh air, and that relationship can be so incredibly beneficial. And so, having a spiritual older brother or older sister, spiritual father, spiritual mother, being taking opportunities to be in relationship, not necessarily that you got to go find one, but just searching for opportunities, whether it's jumping in a group or jumping on a team, to serve in the community where there's some people that are older. Like, man, it'd be great if I could just get to know some. And I haven't met many people who are further along in their faith that if someone who was a little less evolved in their faith had a question about life, that they wouldn't be interested in saying, well, this is what I did, right?
Mhm.
Whether it was a huge mistake and I learned from it, or thank goodness I got this right. I just don't meet many people that are like that, at least not here at our church. I'm sure there are people out there that are just like, "Ah," and everybody's got a curmudgeon somewhere, but I just don't meet many that are like that. I just don't. So that's one thing, is relationships. The second is what I referenced in the question before this, is the biblical narrative, the words of Jesus, those principles. We've got to spend some time reading them. And here's one of the simplest places to go if you want to hear an enormous chunk of how Jesus thinks we ought to interact with our world. We just go to the book of Matthew, which is found in the New Testament. The Bible has 2 sections, an Old Testament and New Testament. The Old Testament chronicles how we get the people of God and how we get to Jesus. The New Testament picks up with Jesus showing up onto the scene and all the way through to the birth of the church, which is now where we're in at this moment, right? So it's in the New Testament. It's the very first book of the New Testament. Again, it's called Matthew, and you just want to go to chapter 5, 6, and 7. Just those three chapters. You can read the entire chapter, all three chapters, in probably 7 or 8 minutes. It's super short, and it's a message that Jesus gives called the Sermon on the Mount, and it's Jesus' very first public address. When I teach out of that, a lot of times we will use a phrase like Jesus 101, or Intro to Jesus.
Mm.
We've done two really long message series that are wrapped around those types of thoughts. And so it's just like, hey, this is what the following Jesus looks like. And Jesus uses his own words to describe, here's how we handle these big, enormous life decisions. And so if you were just to say, you know what, I'm going to read Matthew 5 on Monday, Matthew 6 on Tuesday, Matthew 7, that would take you less than 4 minutes each time. And you were just to rotate 5, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7. If you were just to spend time there and that's it for the next year, you would feel so much more confident about what God desires and how to hear the voice of God than if you had read the entire Bible cover to cover. I guarantee it. If you just were to concentrate on just Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and avoid reading the rest of the Bible because it's a lot. The Bible's huge. I'm not, and don't hear me. Don't be freaking inboxing me saying, "Oh, he said don't read the Bible." That's not what I said. I'm just saying, hey, if you want to hear the voice of God, concentrate day after day on one of those chapters, and you will begin to see the principles that Jesus talks about every single day in your life. Every single day. And if every once in a while you want to feel a little frisky, read James chapter 1. So Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And then maybe on Sundays, like read so 5, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7, James chapter 1. 5, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7, James chapter 1. I'm telling you, it will radically change the way you see your world enormously. And not and or it will confirm that you already see your world the way that Jesus wants you to. One of those two things will happen, and you'll begin to hear the voice of God show up in places you had previously thought he was completely silent.
Hmm. That's awesome. Yeah, I think once you experience certain things and you really like flex that, I don't know, that Holy Spirit muscle,
Yeah,
and you read the word and read what Jesus says, I think you will know better and know what and how he communicates with us. I guess that's what I'm saying.
yeah,
Um, because how do you know how to use the tools that he's given us if you've never really picked one up or
yeah.
picked it up? And I feel like the more you use that, you'll be better equipped.
Mhm.
So, what about when Jesus says yes to something or he speaks to you and you are so confident that that is what Jesus says? What does that look like? Or do you have a personal experience?
Um, when Jesus says yes to something, well, I think I think it's possible that when you're if you're spending time with people that are further along in the faith, if you're spending time trying to understand the principles that Jesus is communicating to us, what I have found is that a lot of times that God speaks in our lives when we weren't asking a question.
Mm.
And I don't know if that's as I'm thinking about it. I don't know if it's because we don't ask as many questions because we have made ourselves familiar with how he answers questions, right? Because we've spent time with the principles of Jesus, and so there aren't as many questions to ask God because he's already given us the answer, and we just know because
Mhm.
we've spent time with those principles. And so when we see that principle at play in our life, it's like I know what God wants here, right? Because he's already answered this question by giving me the principle to stand on. So
Mhm.
I already know how he wants me to handle this, right? I'm trying to think of an example in the real world. Um, like for instance, someone someone in your family gossips about you.
Mhm.
right? That that maybe you made a mistake, right? You made a mistake and they've been talking about you and they tell the whole family, right? And they're telling the whole family. So the question would be, God, how do you want me to handle this? But the truth is, like, God's already spoken to that,
Mhm.
right? God wants us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. And so that's a principle that Jesus lays out. And so immediately it's like, all right, God, can we change? Can we get a little change? Can we put a change order in on the love our enemies, pray for those who persecute us? Because for sure that family member that went and did that, they would fall. I don't know if they quite fall into enemy. Maybe they do, depends on,
Yeah.
but for sure, like there's some persecution, right? Hey, I'm gossiping about you behind my back. And so the very first thing that Jesus says he wants us to do is to pray for them. And so what are we praying for? Are we praying, God, they done said it. So if we could expedite their trip to hell, that would be fantastic. Like he's not saying, it's implied in there that we're not praying for their demise. But what we are praying for is we're saying, God, number one, you need to do something in my heart because I am furious. I'm upset. I'm embarrassed,
Mhm.
right? I feel betrayed, those things. But then we want to move away from ourselves to say, God, what's happening in her life or his life that made him think this would be the best way to help me through this? Like, God, I want to pray for whatever made them think this was the right thing to do. Like, God, I want to pray that somehow they would come to the realization that they've taken something that was already awful that I did, and they've caused even more harm or more hurt with it. And what Jesus knows is that when we begin to earnestly, sincerely, authentically, genuinely pray for the goodwill of people that have hurt us, it changes our mindset in terms of how we're going to interact with them. Because as followers of Jesus, we then begin to recognize that the overwhelming majority of the time that God does something significant in someone else's life, it's through a follower of Jesus
Mhm.
that's filled with the Holy Spirit, that steps into their life, that aids in restoration or aids in rebuilding something, right? And so there's a very good possibility that God will use us, the one that was wronged, to help restore the person who did the wronging.
Mhm.
But in prayer, when prayer is the beginning of that conversation, it can be a very powerful thing because a lot of times what we find as followers of Jesus that prayer doesn't change the mind of God, but it often changes us and it aligns us with the mind of God. And so I think Jesus knows what he's talking about. That's why he says, hey, this is what I want you to do. I want you to love your enemies. I want you to pray for those who persecute you because that prayer won't change them, but it'll change us, which then gives them the greatest shot of actually being changed. So, um, I I I don't actually remember how I got onto this little thing. I was giving you an example of how to practically do it. What was the question? Do you remember?
Yeah, like how, if someone if God is saying yes to something.
Yes,
Mhm.
right. So that that existing principle is there, but a lot of times, again, the answers that God gives us are not when we're asking, it's when He's saying, "Oh, and this is what this looks like." So
Mhm.
we know the principle, and then it's like, "Oh, and this is what it looks like." We've spent time with spiritual brothers, sisters, or big brothers, big sisters, fathers, mothers. We've spent time understanding the principles of Jesus. We weren't even looking for it, but all of a sudden, something unfolds in front of us in our life, and then God says, "This is what I'm talking about." Right? So I have one of those moments. It was probably, gosh, 2009. Yeah, I think it was 2009. My wife and I were in Washington D.C. for vacation. I love Washington D.C. It's one of my favorite places. And we just decided, maybe it's 2010. It doesn't matter. It was 2009, 10, 11, somewhere in there. We just decided, you know what, for 4th of July, we're gonna go to Washington, DC and like do all the things. So I just hit the mic. Do all the things and see like fireworks and all that kind of stuff. And it was incredible. I remember the night of 4th of July, we were at the foot of the Washington Monument watching fireworks, and it was just incredible. It was just fantastic.
So
I love the whole thing. I really, for an enormous period of my life, thought I would be president of the United States, and so I thought, like, this would be my town. You know what I'm saying? Like, that would be my house, and the Washington Monument would be in my backyard. It has not worked out that way, but I just love it. I just love it. So anyway, so we were there, like, just doing a vacation thing, and there's a museum that's dedicated towards to the Holocaust,
yeah.
and so we wanted to go and experience that and walk through it. And one of the very first books, which I know this is going to sound awful, I didn't read a lot in high school. Like, when I say a lot, I actually didn't complete a single book until I got to high school, which I know sounds like, hold on, how did this whole private school thing? Like, look, I know it sounds
That
bad.
education.
It sounds bad, but my strength is if I listen to a lecture, then I remember it and it's done. So
Mm.
as long as I had teachers, which at that time, that's the way teachers taught. They stood in front of the classroom, they just talked and talked and talked, and they assigned you. But I wasn't going to read a book. It just, what was the point? Kids, you should read. I for sure make my kids read. They don't get to do what I did. Anyway, my very first book that I actually read was a book called Night, by Eli. I think it's Wiesel. Though in high school I called it, doesn't matter. I'm pretty sure I called it Wiesel.
I
Um,
read that book.
okay, great.
Yeah.
So that was the very first book that I ever read. And I was in 11th grade when I read it, and it just captivated me. I was already a huge history guy, and so that whole movement and the Nazis and just the horrific things that went on, I was just like enthralled. I cannot believe this happened. And so, of course, that book. And so, to go to the Holocaust Museum, it was just something that I was just drawn to and have always been very interested in, um, and just enormously respectful and also just remorseful. Like, man, I can't believe a people went through this.
Mm.
And so, to have the opportunity to go to the museum was just, it was up there on the things that I wanted to experience and just spend some time learning more about and diving into. And I remember we went and you had to get a time ticket. And so we didn't know that at the time. I didn't do research. And so we walked in thinking it was going to be like the rest of the Smithsonian's where you just walk in and you just go. But they didn't have it time for us. So I had to come back in a couple hours. We got some lunch. We came back. And I remember we went in and you get in this elevator and the elevator closes and it goes up. And then the elevator opens and it's completely different environment than the environment we left. The lobby we walked in was bright and there was just skylights everywhere and lots of windows and lights, and it was just this really cool space. And you go on this elevator though, and the elevator goes up, and then when it opens, you're in this dark place. And the lights are so dim. At least it felt like that relative to where we had come from and to where we were walking into. It just felt dark. And I remember like the displays against the wall, you had to get close to them because like to read them, like the light just it was just so dark. And there was like little rooms with movies that were showing footage of concentration camps and moments of liberation and just where you could see the images, black and white and it's grainy and you could step into those viewing rooms and then walk back outside and there were stories of people and pictures of families and uh, you just took your time at every one of them and you just felt like every one of these stories matters enormously but there's so many of them,
Mhm.
and as you go you're like I don't want to skip one because to that family that's the big story, right? And so you're just taking your time walking through and I remember there were bunk beds that they had taken and they had piled up and they had a picture of when liberation happened and then the army came in to free them and they had taken pictures in these bunk beds and they were just piles and piles of people.
Mhm.
And there was a train car that they had taken and you could go into the train car and the train car had been one that had taken Jews to concentration camps. And so you just went through this whole thing, but it just was this dark, dark place.
Mhm.
And so we're making our way through it, and all of a sudden there's this like light that caught my eye. And I was looking at it, and it was down this little area, and I was like, that looks different. Whatever's there looks different. And so we started walking that way, and we turned, and it was this long white hall, and it was like bright, like just so different than everything else. It was just bright. And I was like, "This, what's the point of this hall?" Like everybody was going through there, and so I started to go down the hall, and there's these rails on the side, and I look over the rail, and there's like a pit, and in the pit is thousands and thousands and thousands of pairs of shoes. And I mean, the shoes are, um, they're black and gray, they're filthy. Um, they're 100% worn and used. You know, it's not like these are, you know, like fake things. Like these are real people's shoes.
Mhm.
And it hit me. I was like, these are their shoes, right? Like the people I've been reading about, like these are their shoes. And I was just sitting there. I was like, golly, that's a lot. These are their shoes. And I was looking through the shoes. I was just like, just picturing like who would, what, what kind of woman would wear this shoe? You know, I'm just thinking like which one? What kind of guy would wear this shoe? And I'm looking at it. And then I saw this teeny tiny little pair of shoes, and it had a flower on it, and the flower still had a little color in it. At the time, well, I still have a little sister, but at the time, my sister was really little. She was 8 or 9 years old. And it hit me. I was like, somebody saw a little girl like my little sister and told her to take her shoes off and then sent her into a gas chamber, furnace, or whatever they ended up doing. But there was a grown man, like I was, who looked at the girl that walked in those shoes and said, "Hey, just take your shoes off. Head right in here. Here's the showers. Here's the whatever." And obviously, the girl didn't come back to get her shoes.
Mm.
And at that moment, I was just like gripped with anger. I was like, what kind of guy would do that? Like, what kind of grown man would look at someone who was wearing those shoes? Like, I can almost, if I can fathom like adult versus adult, like we're at war, you hate me, I hate you. Like, I can almost get there. But for a grown man like myself to look at an 8 or 9 year old or 7 year old, whoever's going to wear that shoe and say, hey, take your shoes off. To be responsible for that, I was just furious. And I was just sitting there, I was thinking, I was like, God, what are we doing? Like, God, what are you doing here? You know? Like this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. And you could have done something. I was furious. And then I immediately went from that to, are there any of these people left that are responsible? And what should we do?
Mhm.
You know, like just grit your teeth kind of anger, you know? And in the middle of all that anger, it wasn't a audible voice, it wasn't a whisper. It was just this movement in my soul where God just said, I have grace even for the people responsible for those shoes.
Mm.
And it took me a little while standing there looking at the shoes to have some peace to say, Jesus really did an enormous work on the cross, and he's taken care of all of my issues. But it was such an enormous work that it even allows grace for someone who told the little girl, take off your shoes, and then murdered her.
Mm.
And I can't actually fathom how that grace fits in with anything that I'm okay with. but I do know that I trust God,
Mm.
and that kind of grace actually does make our world a better place. Not that they are free from consequences this side of life, because they deserve every consequence that's coming to them. But that God says, if you'll give your life to me, the next side of life, I'll make a place for you.
Mm.
And so I think a lot of times that's the way we hear God's voice. Because when I read the principles of Jesus, we see that kind of grace that's there over and over again. No matter what you've done, no matter how horrific it is, Jesus died for your sins. Regardless of whether you think it's unforgivable, Jesus says, I can forgive it. You feel like there's no way you could ever be accepted by God because of what you've done. And Jesus says, yes, I can. Yes, I can. And that's an enormous amount of love and grace that shows up in the principles of Jesus. That it wasn't like I was asking God, hey, what do I do about this? But it was that God was telling me, I've already done something about this, you know? So I think that's probably most often how God teaches us is that he brings to the surface something that we've allowed to kind of sit and dwell inside of us. And then we're put in a situation where we see something in front of our eyes and he just allows that to rise to the surface and say, hey, this is what I was talking about. This is the practical application of that principle that you've been studying, that you've been praying over, that you've been thinking through. This is what that means. This is how it makes sense and applies in everyday life. And a lot of times it's those moments where God is doing the most speaking,
Mm.
not necessarily where he's speaking on demand, you know? I don't know if that helps.
No, for sure. Um, and I guess I'm thinking too, because I think a lot of people struggle with, well, are these my own thoughts
Mhm.
or are these Jesus's words to me?
Yeah.
But I think it just goes back to those principles.
Yeah, it goes back to God's not gonna contradict himself.
Mhm.
And so it's not so much, hey, are these is it how do I differentiate? It's hey, how do I take what I'm hearing and then put it up against what I know to be true? For instance, um, we can be a very emotional people, and emotions are a gift from God. But at the same time, those emotions can be exploited by Satan. I'll give you an example. There are people that wake up in the morning and they think to themselves, they tell themselves, they have these internal conversations that they're worthless, that nobody cares for them, um, that it would be better if they weren't here on the earth. And God is not whispering that to them. That's not an emotion that God is giving to them and that feeling that God is giving to them. That's the enemy exploiting and using a gift that God has given us to feel sadness and sorrow, and he's twisting that with a lie to make us believe something that it's not. And so, what we've got to do is we've got to take the things that we feel and we've got to put it up against the things that we know.
Mm.
And when the things we feel don't match up to what we know, then we've got to say, well, I don't know how to undo this feeling, but for sure, I'm not going to trust the feeling more than what I know to be true. Right. And so we might say, well, I don't know it to be true because I don't feel like anybody cares for me or that I'm worthless. But that's just it. Is we don't decide what we know in the moment. We decide what we know before the moment gets there. So before I ever got to the feeling, I've already come to the conclusion because of the principles of Jesus that I'm a child of God, right? And that God does care for me and that I am loved and I am cared for and I am worth something and he does have a purpose for me. And so I've already established what I know before I wake up in the morning and have this feeling. That way, when that does happen, I can say, man, this doesn't feel like what I know to be true. And I can write down what I know to be true, and it doesn't match this. The problem is we've got to make sure that we've done the pre-work, that we're not cramming for the test at the last second, that we've done the pre-work to say, look, I might have just woken up feeling this way, but I'm not going to discount all of these truths that I've spent time understanding and coming to know this is a fact. I'm not going to throw that out the window because I'm having a bad morning or a
Mm.
series of bad mornings. And so instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin to talk to my spiritual big brothers or big sisters that I've already got in place. And I'm going to say, look, here's the deal. I know this is true, but I don't feel like it anymore. And I don't know what to do. Right. And then you've got to allow someone else to speak into that feeling to say, hey, all right, well, let's see where it's coming from. I wonder where the origin of this thought is happening. Let's let's take some inventory. Let's take a little inventory and just see what's happening. But that requires a little vulnerability,
Mhm.
you know? You and I, our community, right, are an incredible gift that God gives to us, right? And we have the ability to inspire, but oftentimes we have the ability to remind us, one another, of what's right and what's true and what's godly. A follower of Jesus that's full of the Holy Spirit oftentimes does the greatest speaking on God's behalf. And that's a gift, you know, that's a gift.
Yes. And I think that's so awesome that he has gifted us with each other and with the Holy Spirit so we can continue to guide and listen and flex that muscle. And I like what you said about continuing to surround yourself with people and in the Word, um, so you can discern that communication more clearly. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, because I think that's the biggest thing. It's just people discerning their own thoughts and that nudge. And what does that nudge look like?
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's awesome.
Ta-da.
I think you answered majority of everything that people that I feel like have come up and asked like that question. Well, how do I know?
Yeah.
And how do I know it's from God? And there you have it.
Yeah. A Jesus following tribe, Jesus principles that you've studied. 567 James chapter 1. 567 James chapter 1. No, 567 James chapter 1. There you go.
There you go.
That's it.
That's awesome.
That's it.
Okay. Well, until next time.
Yeah.
We'll dig into another topic, and hopefully you guys will text in to podcasts, and that number is
678-661-6330. Just text the single word podcast. You have to text anything else, just the word podcast, 678-661-6330.
Yeah, and we will hit you up next month on our next topic.
That's it.
That's it.
Toodles.
Bye.